Ah, you look tantalizing. You know, I make fun of The View a lot, but that's only because they keep talking. Because COVID also taught Sunny Hostin how to get her groceries delivered.
3 years, that's when I discovered Instacart. And I give them a big tip because they don't always pay their people well. And it's so that's been an issue, I think, for the company. But man, you can get toiletries, you can get fire logs.
Fire logs? She had to tell the audience that she tips big because even she knows she sounds.
It began like any other broadcast of The View. The lights came up, the hosts leaned in with polished smiles, and the studio hummed with the familiar rhythm of chatter. But this wasn't going to be a routine episode. What started as another round of feel-good conversation quickly morphed into one of the most uncomfortable spectacles in daytime television, the kind of exchange that made viewers stop and rewind just to be sure they heard correctly. At the center of it all was Sunny Hostin, who walked into the studio armed with the confidence of someone ready to deliver a lecture, but walked out as the subject of a takedown by two unlikely critics, Greg Gutfeld and Bill Maher.
People have to wonder, where does Sunny Hostin get her opinions?
Yeah.
Like you said, and it's obviously from her husband. She has to tell her what to say on The View, because without it, she's got nothing up there. She's not very bright. But the problem with her is that
if I had any doubt that I was right about the change that's happened in the left, watching people protest for a terrorist organization, that straightened me up pretty quick.
You can see the way Sunny Hostin, the way she's touching her above her eye, and she can't even look at him because she's an activist, not a journalist or whatever it is that.
The unraveling began innocently enough. What followed was far sharper. Sunny pivoted to the term woke, insisting it had been unfairly hijacked by conservatives and weaponized against its original purpose. She reminded the panel that the word was born from Black activism as a call to remain alert to injustice, and she couldn't understand why anyone would think that was a bad thing. On paper, it should have landed as a strong statement.
The term woke has been, in my view, co-opted by the right and weaponized and bastardized. And so I was surprised to hear you use the term because historically, as you know, because I think you're quite brilliant, that woke is a word used by the Black community to note that we must be aware of social injustices.
But words migrate.
So why is that a bad thing?
But Bill Maher wasn't buying it. He calmly acknowledged the origins of the term while pointing out how it had transformed over time into something unrecognizable, even mocked by those who once embraced it. He argued that the left had shifted drastically, saying he could remember when it was conservatives who carried anti-Semitic hostility, not progressives. That line cut deep, not because it was shouted, but because it was delivered like a quiet observation of a truth few wanted to admit.
But words migrate.
Why is that a bad thing?
It's not a bad thing, and originally that was absolutely a great thing. Alert to injustice, who's not for that? But words, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when it was the conservatives who hated the Jews.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sunny's attempt at control began slipping. Her voice faltered as she doubled down, repeating her point rather than addressing Maher's criticism. Then Greg Gutfeld, who had been sitting back with a sly grin, stepped in. With his trademark sarcasm, he dismissed The View as little more than a sideshow, a daytime carnival of political oddities. He compared it to a hospital for human misfailure, a harsh but pointed metaphor that made the audience laugh nervously while Sunny froze in place.
it's about The View. It's become like a medical hospital that displays human misfailure. Like it's like here, let's look at this political oddity. You know, it's like it really is like the left-wing equivalent of a carnival sideshow, except instead of bearded ladies and fat clowns and two-headed cows. Well, let me rephrase that. But The View is a victim of the sunk cost.
This wasn't loud chaos. It was two voices, different in style, but united in purpose, dissecting Sunny's talking points until they crumbled in her hands. Bill Maher with his cool, clinical precision, Greg Gutfeld with a smirk and a jab that exposed the weakness in her delivery. Sunny, meanwhile, leaned back, touched her brow, and visibly struggled to meet their eyes. It was clear she wasn't ready for pushback from two commentators who, on most issues, don't even agree with each other. But the most brutal blows were still ahead. Sunny attempted to elevate the discussion by turning it toward political morality. She repeated her belief that the word woke wasn't the enemy, that conservatives were the ones twisting its meaning. But Maher's response was simple and devastating. Don't tell me the left hasn't changed. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. For a split second, the entire set seemed to pause. Sonny blinked, but no rebuttal came. The contrast between her emotional appeals and his grounded statement made it obvious. Her defense was slipping into incoherence. And then came Greg's hammer. He accused her outright of not having original opinions, claiming that she gets her talking points from her husband. He even said, bluntly, that she wasn't very bright. It was the kind of remark that would usually spark an angry outburst, but instead, Sonny just froze. Her silence said more than any comeback could have.
The truth, and when for years you've been telling lie after lie after lie, now you're carrying this big bag of rocks around you because it's too harmful for their ego to admit that we really were dishonest. And they could be honest. All they would have to say is, look, we hate Trump so much. We were willing to lie about Joe Biden because we felt he was preferable. We thought our lying and our cover-up was on your behalf. Just say that. You're still scum. But
things only grew worse when Sonny's past resurfaced in the conversation. Clips circulated of her appearance on Finding Your Roots, where she learned her family ancestry included European slave owners, an awkward contradiction given her outspoken advocacy for reparations and her framing of herself as part of the oppressed. That revelation, juxtaposed with her constant rhetoric about systemic injustice, became another tool critics used to highlight her contradictions.
Hostin's obsession with race gets thrown back in her face. Today's video comes to us from sunny Hostin. Sounds like a town. We're in sunny Hostin. She was on PBS's Finding Your Roots, a show dedicated to researching celebrity ancestry. For context, Sonny is a staunch supporter of reparations and has made a fortune spewing nonsense about white privilege and racial justice. Well, turns out she's not as oppressed as she claims she is. She's actually the descendant of slave owners from Europe. Here's how she took the news. Roll it.
What I found out was that my mother's family, while they are Puerto Rican, they actually originate from Spain. And the reason that they moved to Puerto Rico is because the slave trade had been sort of canceled in Spain and then Curacao, and then they moved all of their slaves to Puerto Rico. And so the family business, I had been told that they were printers and journalists, but they were in fact enslavers.
And then came the out-of-touch moments. While Bill and Greg calmly debated issues, Sonny's responses jumped from half-baked slogans to grocery store anecdotes. She talked about Instacart again. She brought up brunch. She tossed out terms like systemic oppression and even mentioned oat milk prices as though they were the ultimate sign of political injustice. Her points weren't connected, and it showed. The performance had the energy of a motivational speech, but the depth of a social media rant. Bill Maher looked at her like a teacher listening to a student who hadn't done the reading. Greg didn't even need to say much. His raised eyebrow and smirk told the story. Then came perhaps her most baffling claim, that having nuanced conversations was itself a form of privilege. According to Sonny, if you could calmly discuss complex topics, it meant you were too privileged to understand real struggles. The logic twisted in on itself. Maher responded not with outrage, but with a simple, grounding line: reality doesn't require privilege to be understood. Once again, the silence that followed was damning. Gutfeld didn't need to pile on. His sarcastic grin said enough. But Sonny dug herself deeper. She turned her attention to Republican women, claiming that white women, especially married ones, vote only to protect the patriarchy for the sake of their husbands and children. It wasn't analysis. It was a sweeping insult, painting millions of women as brainwashed followers. The silence that followed wasn't supportive, it was disbelief. Greg tilted his head like he'd just witnessed a slow-motion car crash. Even Sonny's co-hosts looked uneasy.
I think that's bad. The View's co-host, Sonny Hostin, says, "Hold my beer," and is literally claiming Republican women can't think for themselves.
I think that women, white women in particular, want to protect the patriarchy here because it's to their benefit.
Yeah.
They want to make sure that their husbands do well. They want to make sure that their sons do well. They want to make sure that their children do well. And they want to make sure that they do well. Most of the women in some of these studies are married white women.
By now, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Sunny carried a resume that should have made her formidable lawyer, journalist, television host. On paper, she had every advantage. But in practice, she leaned not on reason or evidence, but on buzzwords and emotional posturing. Maher and Gutfeld didn't need to coordinate. Their styles were so different that their critiques hit from every angle. Maher dissected her logic point by point, while Gutfeld mocked the hollowness of her delivery. The tragedy was that Sunny didn't see it. She still carried herself like she was winning, arms crossed, chin high, voice raised with certainty. But the applause she expected never came. Instead, the audience sat in awkward silence, confronted with the disconnect between her confidence and the emptiness of her arguments. Even when Greg pointed out her massive salary as a counterpoint to her claims of speaking for the unheard, Sunny didn't flinch. She just plowed forward, still convinced her words carried the weight of truth.
I make fun of The View a lot, but that's only because they keep talking. Those hens are always clucking. They get to say stupid stuff for an hour every day, and then I get to say stupid stuff for an hour every day, except on purpose. But every now and then, one of those dingbats inadvertently says something that reveals modern liberal thought so perfectly it deserves further study. You know, like a weird serpent that washed up on the beach.
But the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she wasn't debating, she was performing. She wasn't searching for solutions, she was searching for applause. Bill Maher delivered the final strike, not with anger, but with a calm question. How can someone claim to be open-minded while canceling anyone who dares to think differently? That line cut through everything. Sunny had no answer. No witty remark, no righteous defense, just silence. The silence said more than any argument could have. Greg leaned back, smiling. Bill didn't gloat. They didn't need to. The damage had been done, and Sunny had done most of it herself. She continued smiling for the cameras, still spinning her words, still trying to project confidence. But by then, everyone could see it. The performance had collapsed, and the Emperor had no clothes. Sunny Hostin came onto The View ready to lecture, but by the end, she became the example her critics had been waiting for. Bill Maher and Greg Gutfeld didn't just expose her contradictions, they exposed the emptiness of a platform that confuses volume with truth. And for Sunny, it was a lesson delivered not in whispers, but in front of millions.